Hey guys, Trip here, and why won't this guy die? I mean, seriously though. Oh, thank God, finally. That's right. Today we're going to be talking about bullet sponges, particularly in role-playing games. A bullet sponge is any enemy that takes an unrealistic amount of damage before being taken down. Bullet sponges are almost universally loathed in the gaming community, and although people have been complaining about them for years, they keep showing up in our favorite games. They're a particular problem in action RPGs, where statistics and dice rolls often take priority over realism. There seems to be a large portion of the gaming community that has reluctantly accepted bullet sponges as an unavoidable aspect of role-playing games. Some would say that this is just how RPGs work, that if every enemy went down in one or two hits, that it would cheapen the importance of stats and equipment. But is this true? Is there really no way to balance realistic combat with satisfying stat progression? Do we really need to deal with the bullet sponges? Well, let's take a look. Before we talk about ways to avoid bullet sponging, we first need to discuss why bullet sponges exist in the first place. As far as I can tell, there are two main reasons. The first, most obvious, and perhaps most cynical reason is that bullet sponges are a crutch. They're used by developers who don't have a better way of increasing the difficulty of an encounter. Why make the enemy smarter or look for cover when it can just absorb entire clips from your gun? Bullet sponging allows a developer to make a fight harder through sheer attrition. But there's another reason, unique to role-playing games. I don't expect everyone to agree with me here, but one could argue that bullet sponges are a direct result of old RPG mechanics clashing with modern game design. These mechanics are both perpetuating and necessitating the existence of bullet sponging. So what do I mean by that? Well, first, let's consider the main focus of an action RPG. An ARPG focuses on giving your character the best gear and weapons, leveling them up and making them more powerful. This sense of progression is embedded deeply in the game's mechanics, and is most clearly expressed through combat. Your character typically starts off with very weak weapons, poor skills, and little to no armor, and gradually becomes more powerful as the game goes on. This gear scaling makes sense if you want to make the player feel more powerful as the game goes on, but in order to balance a game with such wildly different weapons and armor, you're going to end up with some guns that feel like pea shooters and enemies with an unrealistic amount of health. In early RPGs, this was alright, as the combat was never meant to be taken literally. It was just a reenactment of the game's rules being implemented, and you were supposed to use your imagination to fill in the holes. But when you're trying to translate the old rules of an RPG into the modern gaming sphere, you're going to have some strange results, like revolvers that hurt less than BB guns, or human enemies that can take a dozen arrows to the chest before finally falling over. This is why bullet sponges keep popping up in action RPGs. They're relics of an old way of doing things that don't translate well into modern gaming. As games are starting to look more real, to feel more immersive, we've expected them to behave in more realistic and immersive ways, but the bullet sponges are fighting us every step of the way. Now, I'm not saying that we should streamline role-playing games until they feel like generic shooters, but I do think there are ways to strike a balance between satisfying, semi-realistic combat and the traditional feeling of progression in RPGs. Let's take a look at the Fallout series, for example. Fallout is a game that is infamous for its bullet sponging. Even New Vegas, a game I constantly praise on this channel, is guilty of having regular, human enemies that can shrug off several shotgun blasts to the chest. Fallout is a game filled with many different enemy types, from crazed bandits to radioactive beasts to giant mutants. There are also numerous types of armor and protective gear, not to mention cybernetic enhancements that logically could make an enemy harder to kill. As a result, it's a game where some degree of bullet sponging makes sense, but there are still ways to eliminate it when it becomes unrealistic. For example, the game scales its weapons in such a way that low-level pistols barely chip off any health from an opponent. I think there's a better way to handle this. What if, instead of a low-quality pistol being little more than a Nerf gun, it could be less accurate, have less range, or jam up more often than a higher level version? This would provide us with the same experience of starting off weak and slowly finding more effective gear without the need for the wild differences in damage output that necessitate bullet sponges in the first place. But now we're left with firearms that do an insane amount of damage. How do we balance that? Well, it may be wise to make ammo a bit scarcer and more valuable for both players and enemies. Your opponents have a set amount of ammunition and can actually run out, forcing them to switch to a melee weapon and leaving the player without any ammo to loot. This would also give players an actual incentive to use melee weapons in combat. If ammo is scarce and expensive, then maybe it would be wise to use a sword instead. This provides satisfying advantages and challenging drawbacks to different playstyles, and allows for tactical decision making on the player's part. The same principle goes for armor and other defensive capabilities. If anyone, player or enemy, is wearing regular clothing, they should be taken down in a few shots. Not only would this increase realism, but it would encourage alternative playstyles. If you want to wear that light armor that makes you quieter and move faster, then that should be offset by making it harder to go in guns blazing, encouraging a more stealthy or non-violent approach. Enemies wearing light armor can be utilized in scenes where you want the player to feel powerful, or you need to populate an area with dozens of easily defeatable enemies. If someone is wearing heavy armor, on the other hand, your experience will be wildly different. Projectiles should bounce off of them, small weapons should do almost nothing, and you may need to change your tactics to deal with enemies like this. Likewise, if you're clad in a suit of heavy power armor, you should feel like it. You'd move much slower, much louder, you'd likely need to have high strength and endurance to even wear it, but if you actually manage to utilize heavy armor, you should feel like you've earned your bullet sponging. So, there are numerous ways to alleviate bullet sponging in RPGs while maintaining a sense of player progression. It's really just a matter of clever tweaks and balancing. If you're still not convinced, then you may want to check out the Fallout Nexus, a website full of mods for various Fallout games. Numerous mods already exist that solve these problems in pretty much the exact manner I outlined. It's simply a matter of whether or not the developers are willing to consider these changes. So why did I decide to talk about this? Well, part of it is because I'm a type of person who thinks every problem has a solution. This whole episode started with a Reddit post I found that claimed we should accept bullet sponges as an inevitable part of RPGs. Call me naive, but I don't think we should have to accept anything we don't like. If the gaming industry is willing to evolve, is willing to experiment, is willing to improve upon existing formulas without sacrificing quality or depth, I don't think we should have to settle for old problems that have tested solutions. That might be a tall order, especially considering the state of the gaming industry, but I think it's a mindset we should encourage nonetheless. But hey, that's just my opinion.